The process of growing mushrooms can be complicated, but it doesn't have to be. In the same way that mini kitchen gardens are becoming more popular in households everywhere, mushroom growing kits and soon to be automated fruiting chambers provide a super convenient way to grow mushrooms at home. Personally, I would honestly love to see a world where growing mushrooms at home is as popular as something like growing tomatoes. With many things, sometimes it's best to take the shortest possible path to success, and with mushrooms, that's no different. In this video, we're going to be talking about mushroom growing kits, which is the easiest way for beginners to start growing mushrooms at home. Plus, I'm also going to give you an update on the Mella, which is a mushroom fruiting chamber that is almost ready for production. If you want to skip the stairs and take the elevator in terms of mushrooms, might I suggest trying a mushroom growing kit. It really is the fastest way to start growing mushrooms without any specialized tools or equipment. Here is an example of some mushroom growing kits from a Canadian company called Nature Lion. I got the pink oyster mushrooms, the lion's mane mushrooms, and I also have a black oyster mushroom, which isn't here right now. But as you can see, when I open it up, it's basically just a fruiting block, which is no different from what commercial mushroom growers used to grow mushrooms on a big scale. It's just kind of a miniature version of that. And inside this bag is everything that you need to start growing mushrooms. If you didn't want to buy a pre-made kit and you wanted to make your own, you totally can. Basically what you do is take something like hardwood sawdust and some bran, sterilize it in one of these mushroom grow bags, add some grain spawn, wait for it to colonize, and you'd eventually have the same thing that I'm holding in my hand here. And if you do want to make those, we do have plenty of substrate recipes that you can go check out. I'll link to those in the description below. But if you wanted to skip that whole step and jump right to the fun part, which is growing mushrooms, then a great place to start is one of these kits. If you've grown mushrooms before, I know what you're thinking. Why would I want to mess around with a mushroom growing kit? I could just make my own. But no matter what your level of experience, there's still a lot of good reasons why you might want to play around with a kit. For me personally, I like them because you can try to play around with a bunch of different species. For example, right now we have lion's mane. We just finished growing some pink oysters. We have some black oyster mushrooms growing as well. So it allows you to kind of play around with some different species in the fastest possible time without having to go through the whole process of making grain spawn and making your fruiting blocks and the whole rigmarole of growing mushrooms. Now, if you're a beginner and you've never grown mushrooms before, it's obviously the best place to start because it can give you a feel of what the mushroom growing process is and give you the, the best part of it, which is growing and harvesting the mushrooms, and let you decide if you want to invest in all the other stuff that you got to do, such as maybe get a pressure cooker and some of the other specialized tools and equipment that you'll need to actually make fruiting blocks of your own. Now, there's a bunch of different mushroom grow kits available on the market, and depending on where you are, one choice might be better than the other. So if you're in Canada, that's where Nature Lion is from. We're not affiliated with them or anything, but they sent us some of these blocks to try out. Also, there's a company called What the Fungus that also sells mushroom growing kits. If you're in the US, you might want to check out either North Spore, who has a bunch of mushroom growing kits. Back to the Roots is a really popular brand that has specifically oyster mushrooms, and I think they also have pink oyster mushroom growing kits. And also there's another company called Forest Origins. Again, I'm not affiliated with any of these companies, but I know they all have good quality mushroom growing kits, and it's a great place to start. Mushroom growing kits are specifically designed to just allow you to grow mushrooms on your countertop, much like I have this kit here. And for fresh air anyways, it's perfect, right? When you're growing mushrooms out in the open, they're getting as much fresh air as they need. The one thing that's a little difficult sometimes with mushroom grow kits, depending on where you live, is the amount of humidity. So if you live in a really dry climate, it might be kind of hard to expect mushrooms, especially to pin when they're just sitting on your countertop. But that's why quite often they'll come with a fancy little spray bottle and you can just kind of mist your mushrooms as they're going. And what you're doing with this is you're not technically watering the mushrooms, you're actually just providing a little bit of humidity that's going to prevent the mushrooms from aborting before they start to grow to full size. It might also depend on the type of mushroom that you're growing, whether or not you're going to have success just growing it on your counter. For whatever reason, lion's mane seems to grow really well just out in the open where we are. I guess it depends also on the time of year. In the very dry winter months, it doesn't grow as well, but in the spring and the fall, it can grow pretty nicely. Oyster mushrooms are a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes if they don't have enough humidity when they're starting to pin, then they will just abort and they won't grow at all. So that's why sometimes when you're reading reviews reviews on Amazon, for example, for like a back to the roots kit, a lot of people will say it didn't work or my mushrooms didn't grow. And most often it's not because the kit itself was no good, it's just because the countertop conditions were no good. But usually, again, if you just make sure it stays moist, especially right at the surface and especially at the early stages of growing mushrooms, you're gonna have a fair amount of success. Now, if you wanna step it up and really increase your chances of success with a mushroom growing kit, you might wanna consider making a shotgun fruiting chamber. No, this has nothing to do with a shotgun. It's basically a tote that has a bunch of holes drilled into it that kind of looks like it was blasted with a shotgun. And what that does is it provides a lot of fresh air coming through that tote, but the bottom layer of it is layered in perlite, which has been humidified, and that perlite will slowly release the humidity over time, so it creates an environment that has both fresh air from the airflow through the holes and also humidity from the water that's evaporating off of that perlite. So a shotgun fruiting chamber can be built really cheaply, and it will really increase your chances of success with growing mushrooms at home. So if you wanted to step up your mushroom growing game just a little bit more, you might want to consider something like the Mella. Now, if you've been hearing me talk about this probably for the last few months, you might even be sick of me talking about it because it's still not available to the public, but I promise it's going to be available very, very soon. And if you want to be the first to know when it's actually available, make sure you click the link in the description and go sign up to the mailing list for FirstBuild, so you'll be the first to know when this thing's actually available and all the details as they start to roll it out. Nonetheless, this is the Mella version 1.5, the prototype, and I've had the chance to grow lots of different mushrooms in here, and it's just way better than even the original prototype, and I'm super excited about it. It's definitely cleaner, which I mentioned in the previous video. It just is fully automated. You don't really have to worry about anything as you're growing mushrooms in it. And it also just looks really cool. You can see that the light's shining on the mushrooms. It's a great little centerpiece to show off your mushroom growing kits as you're growing them. And I guess the other thing that's really nice is it's much larger. So you can see that there's 3 full-size mushroom growing kits inside of this chamber. So now I've had the chance to grow chestnut mushrooms. I've had the chance to grow blue oyster mushrooms. I've had the chance to grow pink oyster mushrooms. And now we have some black oysters and some lion's mane growing in this chamber. So the first kit that I actually grew in the Mella 1.5 was actually the pink oysters. Now, pink oyster mushrooms traditionally, like all other oyster mushrooms, they like fresh air, and they also like to have high humidity, both of those which the Mella provides lots of. Now, pink oysters, though, they don't need as much fresh air as some of the other oyster mushroom species, and they also like a little bit of a warmer temperature, but this thing doesn't have temperature control, but it does control the amount of fresh air and the amount of humidity. So the pink oysters actually did really well in there. They grew super fast, and they grew this nice, huge, beautiful cluster of pink oyster mushrooms without really having to do anything. All I did was check it once a day and notice that they were basically doubling in size every 12 hours, which was really cool. We ended up harvesting the pink oyster mushrooms and making some pink oyster mushroom bacon, which is really good if you ever get the chance. But pink oyster mushrooms worked perfectly at the stock settings. The next one we grew in here were some oyster mushrooms, and they were just blue oyster mushrooms that were growing just on regular sawdust. Now, blue oyster mushrooms are traditionally really just terrible in terms of fresh air. They need so much fresh air or else they grow very weird looking with tiny little caps. But inside the Mella, again at the stock settings, they did pretty well. And as you can see, they had a reasonably sized caps. And for the fact that they were just growing on sawdust and I had basically ignored them the whole time, I think they turned out really, really well. We also harvested and ate those ones and they were delicious. The third type of mushroom that I tried growing in the Mella 1.5 was lion's mane mushroom. And lion's mane is one of my favorite mushrooms, and typically it's one of the easiest mushrooms to grow, but as you can tell from this block here, it doesn't look amazing, and there's a couple of reasons for that. It pinned really nicely right off the bat and started to form a nice, beautiful lion's mane fruiting body, but eventually it started to turn brown, and we didn't get that nice, beautiful, luscious lion's mane fruiting body that you'd normally get when growing lion's mane. This could be for a number of reasons. First of all, where I had it in the Mella was right by the fan, and I think there was a lot of air that was constantly blowing over this fruiting body, which is why it would have dried out a little bit and started to turn brown right at the top. This also would have slowed down the growth a little bit, which is why this is a lot smaller. And to be honest, even if we kept it in there, I don't think this thing is gonna get any bigger. Also, as we were growing this, I took it out of the chamber quite often, either for for like filming random videos or random live streams that we did, or just for showing people around the office how it was growing. And sometimes I would forget to put it back in, so it didn't experience those pristine conditions that would be typical if we would have just left it in there the whole time. And thirdly, I wasn't babying this thing at all. We had left over the weekend and weren't really checking up on it. And when I'd come back after a few days, that's when I noticed it started to be brown. So if I would have been paying more attention to how this thing was growing, it probably would have turned out a little bit better. Still, I think it did pretty okay. And I know that once we pull this thing off and do a second flush, we're gonna get a much better looking lion's mane. One small piece of feedback for FirstBuild. Again, this is a mid version between the first prototype and the consumer version, but little things like the door kind of gets stuck when you're opening and closing it, and all you got to do is tap it and close it. But again, these are the things as you're working through a prototype, but let's see if we can get that fixed. In terms of setting the environmental conditions inside the Mella, currently that's done through an app that you can just like log in and connect to Wi-Fi, and you can control the amount of fresh air that's brought in by the fan, and you can check on the humidity and everything. But I think for the consumer version, they're gonna be using some knobs. So basically there'll just be a panel. I don't know if it'll be right on the side or on the front, but you'll easily be able to like dial up the fresh air, and you'll be able to monitor the humidity right by panel without having to log into an app. And personally, I think that's a lot better. And maybe that would have made this process a little bit easier to do, because if I would have noticed that the lion's mane was browning, maybe I would have turned down the amount of fresh air a little bit so that fan wasn't blowing so constantly. And it's just a little bit easier to kind of fine tune the conditions and easily respond to how your mushrooms are growing inside the chamber. So that's gonna be on the next update. And I should have another video where we're going over some of those controls. One other thing that often gets overlooked when growing mushrooms from a kit is the fact that you can get second or even third crops from your mushrooms. So once we go ahead and harvest this lion's mane fruiting body, you can put it back into fruiting conditions and get a second or even a third flush. Now, one thing that you can do in order to make that even better and really help out your second flush is to rehydrate your block. And basically you'll do that by just putting it upside down in a bowl of water so it can, suck up some of that water and rehydrate the block, because at the end of the day, mushrooms are 80 to 90% water, which is really important. So if you can rehydrate the block, you'll quite often have a better second or third flush. But eventually, the mushrooms will tire out. They can't produce mushrooms forever, and eventually it will be done. But remember, the inside of this block is just hardwood sawdust and mushroom mycelium. So it's actually a really nice thing to break up and add to your garden or add to your compost pile. And sometimes you might even get a bonus fourth or fifth flush that might happen outside, where you don't have to worry about the block eventually contaminating. The only thing that you can't really recycle is this mushroom grow bag. Unfortunately, mushroom growing still depends heavily on these plastic grow bags, and you need to have these because they're autoclavable and you can sterilize them and put them into a pressure cooker to sterilize the substrate. But yeah, unfortunately the plastic bag part of it is fit for the pit, but again, you can put the inside of it into a compost pile, and that's very recyclable. So you might be wondering if there's other things that you can do with your mushroom growing kit other than just growing mushrooms in a fruiting chamber or on the counter. And absolutely yes, you can. Because when you think about it, a mushroom growing kit is basically just fully colonized sawdust. It's really no different than sawdust spawn. So you can really treat a mushroom growing kit just like you would a bag full of spawn. So for example, if you wanted to take a kit and instead of growing mushrooms, you maybe would want to break it all up and add it to another pasteurized substrate like pasteurized straw or pasteurized wood chips. You can grow mushrooms using other methods, such as the 5-gallon bucket method, which we have a video on that you can go ahead and check out. Or even if you wanted to do like the laundry basket method, or even if you wanted to do something like an outdoor garden bed where you'd break this up and you'd spread it evenly throughout a pasteurized substrate out in your garden and grow mushrooms outside. The other thing that you could actually do is, when you think about it, again, this is just mycelium on sawdust. So if you wanted to save this culture so you can grow mushrooms in perpetuity, basically save the mushroom culture on agar, you could totally do that. You'd take a little bit of the kit, you'd put it out on an agar dish, that would grow out the mycelium, and you'd probably have to transfer it a couple times to deal with the contamination, but then you would have your own mushroom culture, whatever that species is or whatever the strain was that was on the kit, and you could save that forever and make your own mushroom growing kits that were exactly the same in perpetuity. So again, there's lots of different things you can do with a mushroom growing kit. It's basically just colonized substrate in a bag, so you can have a lot of fun and experiment and grow all sorts of mushrooms in all sorts of different ways. So So if you've never grown mushrooms before, I really hope that this video has kind of convinced you that maybe you want to try growing mushrooms with a mushroom growing kit. Again, there's links in the description for some companies' kits that I've tried and used and work really great. I'm not affiliated with any of them, but again, Nature Line was the kits that I've tried in this video. I've also tried Back to the Roots kits before, but you can also check out North Spore and What the Fungus, all of which are really good mushroom growing kits. If you have grown mushrooms from a kit before, I'd love to know what you think. So let me know in the comments some of the things you like about kits, some of the things you don't like about kits, or really anything that you want to comment about mushroom growing kits. So thanks again for watching this video. I'm Tony from FreshCap.com, and we'll see you in the next one.